All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the CDR Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. We are loving our Thursdays at 10 o'clock Eastern. Every Thursday for the last several months now, we've been connecting with the Duke Lemur Center and doing all kinds of amazing science and research, going behind the scenes, learning about the fossils, learning about how they study lemurs, getting out in the forest, and checking out some of the population of lemurs that they have. It has been a ton of fun. So founded in 1966 on the campus of Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, the Duke Lemur Center is a world leader in the study, care, and protection of lemurs, Earth's most threatened group of mammals. So with more than 200 animals across 14 species, the Duke Lemur Center houses the world's largest and most diverse population of lemurs outside of their native Madagascar. So there's an incredible amount of research that takes place at the Duke Lemur Center, and today marks the final session of a 4-part series we've been doing, diving deeper into these research activities. Today, we're going to be joined by Marina Blanco, research scientist at Duke Lemur Center, and she's going to share a little bit today about some really cool lemur adaptations, and that is hibernation in dwarf lemurs. So Marina, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We're excited for session 4, and we're excited to learn a little bit more about lemurs.
Thank you very much. I actually appreciate the opportunity to talk about my favorite lemurs, the dwarf lemurs. I know they are not maybe the most popular ones, and I think in part because they are quite elusive and actually hard to see even if you go to Madagascar. So I will be ready to start. Let's try this. Can you see the presentation?
We got it, nice and full screen.
All right, so let's see if it moves. Yes. Perfect. So if you have been following some of the earlier presentations in this research series, by now you may be quite familiar with lemurs and why lemurs came to be and why Madagascar is such an amazing place, biodiverse place in terms of forest types and wildlife. So just a quick reminder, of course, there are more than 100 species of lemurs. And if we were to sort of group all these different lemurs, we can do so in 5 major families. And some families actually have one member, and that's the case of the Darwintonidae family, only including the II that you have already heard about. Other families like Lemuridae actually include many different types of lemur, the ring-tailed dwarf lemurs, the black and white rough lemurs, brown lemurs. Third family is Indridae, and of course they include the Shifacas, the charismatic Indri, and other lemurs like the woolly lemurs, the Avahis. Then, of course, the Lepidlemuridae, and this is a family including several species of sportive lemurs, lepilemurs. And last week, Lydia talked about sportive lemurs a little bit because they are quite specialized in, being able to live on mature leaves. And finally, we have the CHEIROGALEIDAE, and this is the family, of course, where our stars, the dwarf lemurs, are included, but dwarf lemurs are not the only members of the family CHEIROGALEIDAE. And if we were to sort of define all these members, we say that they are all nocturnal and they are quite small in size. And let me show you some examples. We have, of course, the dwarf lemurs, also the hairy-eared dwarf lemurs. They are members of the CHEIROGALEIDEs. This is only one species of hairy-eared dwarf lemur. We have the giant mouse lemurs, and these are Mirsa, and they are 2 species. They live in the western dry deciduous forests of Madagascar. We have the mouse lemurs, and there are up to 25 species of mouse lemurs, and probably more to come. They are the most diverse of the CHEIROGALEIDEs. Some species live in very small areas in Madagascar, and some have broader geographic distributions. They are very diverse and flexible. And of course, mouse lemurs include the smallest primates on Earth. Finally, we have a fork-marked lemur, Fanner, and these are all also CHEIROGALEIDes. And if you want to ask the question, do dwarf lemurs hibernate? this is the focus of this presentation. What about the other members of CHEIROGALEIDES? Do they all hibernate? Check for the dwarf lemurs. Well, we don't really know much about hairy-eared dwarf lemurs. We do know that they sort of disappear part of the year inside tree holes. We don't really know what they do inside the tree holes, but it is likely that some of these creatures may hibernate, but we don't know much about them. We need more research. The same goes to the giant mouse lemurs. We know that MIRSA, some anecdotal observations indicate that these lemurs can be called to the touch when you handle them. They also sort of disappear from the forest part of the year. So it is likely that they may hibernate, but we need more research to be conclusive. And then mouse lemurs, here it gets really messy because some species and some mouse lemurs can actually hibernate, but some don't. And which ones do and which ones don't, it's actually quite complicated. So they are called facultative hibernators, which means that sometimes they can, but not always, like your dwarf lemurs, that they are obligate hibernators, because they all do. And finally, we have fanner, the fork-marked lemurs, and we know for the fact that they do not. They do not hibernate. And if you were to ask me what is different about fanner from the rest of the CHEIROGALEIDE members, I could say one major difference is their dietary habits. They feed on gums, on plant secretions, and they can be available basically year-round. Maybe not the same three species will produce the same secretion, but the fact that they can feed on foods that are available year-round really differentiates fanner from the rest of the other members, especially dwarf lemurs, who are fruit specialists, that they rely on fruits. And as you may know now, fruits are not only very seasonal in Madagascar, but quite unpredictable, in that some years, if you have a particularly dry year, not many fruits may be produced. So for today, I sort of would like to try to answer three general major questions. One is, are dwarf lemurs special? I know this may sound like a tricky question. Of course, they are special, like every single lemur. But what type of animal dwarf lemur is? Is it that different from others? And in which categories they fall? Another question that I would like to answer is, are there many kinds of dwarf lemur? And we know Madagascar has a diversity of forest types, and you will find out that there are almost as many dwarf lemurs as forests in Madagascar. So I'm going to show some examples of dwarf lemurs that I have studied. And you may also know that here at the Duke Lemur Center in North Carolina, we have some dwarf lemurs. And so you may ask the question, can the dwarf lemurs at the Lemur Center hibernate? So let's focus on the first question. I'm going to go very general here. All living things, all animals need energy to live, to function. Things like digesting food or moving around, mating. And those functions happen within temperature range. Animals need to thermoregulate. They need to control their body temperature, so those functions can happen. And here I'm showing you some example of a type of animals, amphibians and reptiles, and they are called ectotherms. This is one type of thermoregulation. You might have heard the term cold-blooded before. It's not really accurate. It's better to say ectotherms, and it means all these animals that depend on external sources of heat to regulate body temperature. And because of that, because they rely on the environment, their body temperature really changes depending on whether it is hot or cold outside. And see if you can follow here in this graph. You see snake here. This is your example of ectotherm. And here in the x-axis, we see ambient temperature. And as the ambient temperature increases, this is in degrees Celsius, the temperature of the snake also increases. And you can imagine a situation, if it's really hot outside, the snake may move to a shady place. If it's really cold, the snake may move to a sunny spot. But snakes cannot really produce any heat by themselves. They rely on the temperature of the environment. So other types of animals, most mammals, most birds, they are called endotherms. And warm-blooded is another way to define this group. Endotherms can produce heat internally to maintain body temperature. And that body temperature tends to stay fairly stable, regardless of how cold or hot it is outside in the environment. And so part of the energy that animals get from food goes into all these different functions and includes maintaining this temperature at a relatively stable level. And that includes humans, monkeys, lemurs, most of the mammals and birds as you know them. But things can get a little more complicated because this is just to show you the case of an endotherm, in this case the bobcat. The temperature of this bobcat remains fairly stable, as the ambient temperature increases or decreases. All right. Some animals, however, can sort of do a little bit of both. They can behave like an endotherm, and so part of the year you will see this is a marmot here, an Arctic ground squirrel. They are active, they are out there, feeding, mating. But when the winter comes, they are going to become quite inactive. Their body temperature, if you were to touch this hamster or this squirrel, is going to be cold to the touch. Their body temperature is going to be very similar to the soil where they are basically finding shelter. So they are behaving a little bit like an ectotherm during winter time. And so what do we call these animals? These animals can alternate between this stable temperature part of the year and this variable temperature another time. They're called heterotherms. Heterotherms can switch between maintaining stable, steady body temperature and relying on environment. And in this group of animals, you will find many, and the list is growing as we study more animals: ground squirrels, marmots, and dwarf lemurs. So the most extreme example of a heterotherm is hibernation. Dwarf lemurs are heterotherms. And this is something that I hope will help clarify what I mean. This is a temperature profile. We have temperature here. Imagine all these points by, collected by a sort of thermometer-like. We are seeing here the month of the year. And this is not the temperature profile of a dwarf lemur. It's a temperature profile of possibly a squirrel, because what we see here, the active season happens May, June, July. This is the time where it's the spring and summertime in the northern hemisphere. The temperature of the individual here is fairly stable and fairly elevated. But then fall comes before winter, temperature drops. And we can be pretty sure that this temperature here, close to freezing temperature and even below zero a little bit, that's the temperature of the hibernaculum. This is the place where the particular animal is hibernating. And this is the hibernation season. It happens up to 7 months a year in this case, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, yes. What you see here are these peaks. And this happens to all hibernators with very few exceptions. What happens is that when they are hibernating every 2 weeks or so, a little bit longer here, what happens is that individual will heat up, will use a lot of the energy that was saved as fat deposits. They will heat up for a few hours, less than a day, 12, 24 hours, and they will arouse. They will come out of that hibernation state for a few hours, and then they will go back to this hibernation mode. And these arousals seem to be, of course, indispensable, critical. They are spending a lot of energy to arouse. And what happens is that during these few hours, a lot of the functions that basically are stopped or severely slowed down during hibernation happen. It's almost like the body needs to reset at some point in order to be able to continue hibernating. So the idea why these arousals occur and what triggers the arousal is also a matter of discussion and active research. Could be a topic for a different presentation. But this is sort of the pattern what you would see in a dwarf lemur as well. You would see a period of active season when dwarf lemurs are mating and having offspring, and they are basically eating a lot in order to get fat, in order to hibernate for several months a year. So to the question, are dwarf lemurs special? What I want to get from this is that yes, they are special, of course. They are the only primates that always hibernate in Madagascar. But in a way, they are like many other animals in the animal kingdom which use hibernation as a strategy to save energy. And you will see that the pattern here of hibernators are relatively small animals relying on food that is scarce for part of the year. And so they need to really save energy during those periods of food scarcity. So what about the kinds of dwarf lemurs out there? For that, I would like to take you to Madagascar. And you probably saw this slide before from Lydia's presentation, just to show you once again all these different forest types. You have dry deciduous forests in west of Madagascar. You have rainforest on the east of Madagascar. In the central part of the country, the central highlands, you have high elevation forests. They call it habitats in Madagascar. And so, in a way, you can match, if you will, a type of dwarf lemur to a type of forest. Some of the dwarf lemurs, for example, here you have a smaller dwarf lemur, is a dry forest specialist. You only find this type of dwarf lemur in dry forest. You have larger, almost double the size of the dry forest specialist, dwarf lemurs only occupying rainforests in Madagascar. You even have a special type of dwarf lemur, and this is my favorite, a dwarf lemur only occupying the high elevation forest. Is a high altitude specialist. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples in one of the sites that I have been working on for several years. Is a site in central eastern Madagascar called Sinjorivu, where we find two, not one, but two type or species of dwarf lemur living together next to each other. And this is generally, you see a lot of the forest is confined to the hills. So when you think about forest in Madagascar, you think, oh, it's, subtropical forest, it's hot and humid. But as I mentioned, in the central highlands of Madagascar, because of the elevation, these forests can get really cold. And I think an image can explain is better than words. We have full winter gear here, scarves and everything. You can get frosts. Sometimes it's really cold. A perfect place to study hibernation, if you will, because you can understand dwarf lemurs. Not only we not find fruit during the winter time, but because it's so cold, they have to spend a lot of their energy in trying to keep warm. So let's say you want to study dwarf lemurs and want to go to Madagascar and do this. If you go to the forest, you may see this, if you're lucky, basically eye shine and an individual few seconds later gone. You need to find ways to be able to study them, to follow them, to know what they're doing. And one way to do it, of course, is to capture them temporarily and put small collars. And these collars have a small transmitter, which is beeping at a certain frequency, and we can find the beep, with the radio and antenna, and be able to find their location and be able to follow them around. So we put these little collars, and then of course we release these dwarf lemurs back in the forest, and then hours later we try to follow them around. And the active season also means the rainy season, so it can get a little challenging to follow these guys when it's rainy. And here I want to show you sort of a day in the life of a dwarf lemur researcher. The first video here shows the campsite view, and this is, imagine that we capture a dwarf lemur and we want to release them later that day, or we just wait until it's dark to go out there and follow them. Second video shows the lemur release. Once we put a little collar, we go to the place where we capture the dwarf lemur, and so it can go back to their sleeping site. And they will probably find other dwarf lemurs in that sleeping site. We think of nocturnal lemurs and dwarf lemurs as solitary because if you follow them at night, they tend to eat by day. However, I do not call them solitary because they live in social groups. Usually they share sleeping locations with another members of that family unit. Usually pair, and a female and a male, and offspring from here. The third video that you see here is showing you when we are going to the forest and try to wait, follow them. Of course, dwarf lemurs are very agile, they're beetles, they navigate the forest on top of the canopy, jumping around. We humans have to relax the ground and get a little challenging during the rainy season when small streams of water can turn into rivers a few hours later. Interesting. And then, of course, we have to be active during the night, and some of the nights during this period can be stormy. We have to make decisions as to whether keep our arms high with an antenna or of night. I don't want to discourage you to do research on dwarf lemurs by showing you videos. On the contrary, I want to give you a sense of how adventurous. So when we put little collars and we try to find what is lemurs or what these lemurs do, we can see that they occupy, in some cases, nests using the top. Sometimes they occupy tree holes. In this photo, you have two sets of eyes. We are waiting for them to be active so we can follow them. We also learn that when dwarf lemurs hibernate, they go underground. And now I'm going to show you a very short video of a loom where these dwarf lemurs hibernate underground, so you can get a sense of the soil texture and how deep these dwarf lemurs hibernate. I know that many of you may find this video interesting, even fascinating, but some may be a little disturbed that we are disturbing these dwarf lemurs from their natural hibernation. And I have to say that we do take this job with great responsibility. We know that we are disturbing these lemurs. We put them back a few hours later. We do this as means to get as much information as we can about them and be able to learn more about these creatures. And we have learned quite a few things over the years. It's still a lot to know. As I mentioned, and as you just saw, dwarf lemurs in the rainforest of Madagascar, they hibernate underground. How long they do, it really depends. It depends on the species. It also depends on other factors, anywhere between 3 months a year up to 7 months a year. I have seen one particular individual, we monitor her. She went into hibernation at the very end of February in Madagascar, and she came out at the very end of September, 7 months later, and she didn't even move from the same spot. Maybe I don't need to clarify this, but during this hibernation period, dwarf lemurs do not go out and eat. Basically, they rely on all the fat that they store during the active period to survive hibernation. How do they avoid competition? So we know that there are 2 species at Sinjorivu, and that one of them really sort of expand on the menu, and they end up eating some of the fruits and flowers that the other species doesn't, and to find ways to be able to obtain food when there are so many dwarf lemurs out there. And this is not a very technical answer. How do they get fat? Well, they really eat a lot. And this is the case. If you follow them in the 2 months preceding hibernation, they spend a lot of time eating, and most of that food goes right back in the tail. They are really storing a lot of fat, and that fat is primarily deposited in their tails. So just to show you a different forest, we move to the northwest of Madagascar. Now it's a dry forest, and so it's a different type of dwarf lemur. It's a dry forest specialist. We follow very similar protocols and methodology. As I mentioned, we need to have them in hand for a few hours, so we need to set up traps very high in the trees in order to entice them to come and eat the fruit inside of the traps. And that's also a challenging activity zone. Put colors, and we find them during the day that they are sleeping inside tree holes. This video, you might not, unfortunately, don't hear the sound. I want you to get a sense of what the forest sounds like and what it looks like. Very different from, I hope you get from what you just saw at Sinjorivu. Dry leaves on the ground, the canopy is much open, is certainly more dry, you can feel it. And the dwarf lemurs living here are much smaller, grayer. So just to illustrate the different types of dwarf lemurs and the different types of forest. The other one is going to listen. They happen to belong to the same family unit, so they end up going to the same tree hole. All right, so in Western Madagascar, we find that dwarf lemurs hibernate actually inside tree holes. They do not hibernate underground, and so that's different from their counterparts at Sinjorivu and other rainforest environments. They also hibernate for many months, up to 7 months a year. Some studies done by colleagues from Germany done a few years ago, they were analyzing the kind of fruits that the dwarf lemurs eat. They found that they are high in sugar, they have high sugar content, and that those sugars are rapidly converted by dwarf lemurs into fat. And that fat, again, going into the tail. You can see here, this tail is having some fat deposited, and it will continue to grow. Something interesting that seems to happen in the dry forest of Madagascar is that they need to deposit a lot of fat, of course, to survive hibernation. It seems like some of that fat is actually metabolized into water during hibernation. And this is especially true in these environments because water is a limited resource. And so to avoid dehydration, they are using the fat to survive and also to get water out of it. So to the question of, are there many kinds of dwarf lemurs? Yes, there are many species, at least 9 that we know. and different dwarf lemurs live in different forests. And so even though they all hibernate, because they're only hibernators, where they hibernate or for how long they hibernate really depends on the species. So now let's go to the question, can dwarf lemurs at the Lemur Center hibernate? So let me show you some examples of the dwarf lemurs that we have here, and that they are part of our study. You may not know that the Lemur Center has, as far as I know, the only population of dwarf lemurs outside of Madagascar. We have this unique opportunity to study them more closely here. And as I hope I convince you to, that all dwarf lemurs hibernate, it means that they have to alternate between these periods of fattening to get really fat and then hibernate. They evolve to hibernate. This is their natural condition. So how can we help these dwarf lemurs at the Lemur Center hibernate? Of course, they're not in Madagascar, they're here in North Carolina. And so some of the things that we do is that we sort of change their diets depending on the season. Of course, in Madagascar, there is no fruit for several months a year. Here, we are not removing food completely from them, but there is a summer type diet with fruits and veggies and things like that, and we keep these dwarf lemurs in rooms at relatively warm temperature. And then when winter comes, they have less food to eat, and we can put them in rooms that are cooler to simulate winter conditions. You can see in this video here, dwarf lemur doesn't have a tree to sleep in, but we put these little boxes that act as tree holes that they can choose to use during the hibernation season. You can see here this female tottenham with a fairly large tail, there's some fat in there. And so we have this unique opportunity to really take a close look at these animals, these amazing animals. And we have learned a few things over the year. There's still a lot to learn. We know that there are very dramatic changes that happen in the bodies of these dwarf lemurs when they are hibernating. Some examples: when they are active, their heart beats more than 200 beats per minute. Not too many to detect. But when they are hibernating, that heart rate decreases significantly down to 6 to 8 beats per minute. And the same goes to things like breathing. They would breathe about 50 times a minute, like as humans. But when they're hibernating, they don't breathe continuously. They breathe every 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And things like brain activity that we have been able to measure, when they're active, their brain activity is consistent with that of other mammals like humans. You see a pattern when they're sleeping or when they're awake. But when they're hibernating, that activity is almost undetectable. It's almost like a flat line in an EKG, in EEG study. And so I want to show you, this is an example of the kind of studies that we can do at the Lemur Center that would be very difficult, almost impossible in Madagascar. I want to show you this, and this video is running right now, okay? So I want you to focus on this image, and I wanted to see if you can see any evidence of breathing here. Okay, this is Auckland. This is one of the males in the Lemur Center, and is obviously hibernating. So just try to look if you see any signs of movement. And this video is really long. Sarah Clark from the UC took this a few months ago. Do you see? Now you see. This is a movement. There are some breathing events. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and this happens again every 15 minutes or so. You see these very clear breathing events. They're slowing down now. And then after a few seconds, okay, we'll go back to this state where it's almost invisible. Still one more there. Okay, so answer the question, the last one, can dwarf lemurs are the DLC hibernate? And the answer is yes, that we are trying to replicate or reproduce as much as we can the conditions that they would have to face in Madagascar in terms of food, in terms of temperature, so they can express hibernation in their natural condition, and really try to find ways to study them and learn more about them at the Lemur Center without, of course, using any invasive techniques or methodologies. I want to sort of end this presentation with the slides of all the people that are involved in research, from the Lemur Center in the bottom to people in Madagascar. This is, of course, teamwork. You know, behind every question that we want to answer about dwarf lemurs or in any other discipline, there is a group of people behind participating in that answer, and they have very different roles, but it's definitely teamwork. The last thing I want to mention is this video that you can go if you're interested in learning a little bit more about hibernation. This is a very short clip from a TED talk that was in part made possible by a colleague of mine, Dr. Sheena Faherty. She is also used to study dwarf lemurs and help prepare these. It's a very educational and fun, and talks a little bit about dwarf lemur hibernation, but also hibernation in other animals. So with that, I want to finish, and I'll try to answer some questions.
All right. That sounds great, Marina. Thanks for that great presentation, taking us into the world of dwarf lemurs. They're definitely a really cool species, although, like you said, hard to find. And yeah, they lead really exciting lives. And you know, that hibernation is pretty amazing, that something so small can store up enough energy just to take 7 months off if food is bad or something like that. That's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, now's the time for those who are tuning in. Lots of questions have already started coming in via the chat bars. Send in some of those questions. Let us know where you're viewing from. In fact, I'm going to bring Genevieve in. Genevieve is hanging out with us in Oshawa. I'm going to bring her into the call. And Genevieve, you can go ahead with your question.
In the winter time, when the lemurs that do not hibernate, how do they survive? How do they get their food, and how do they keep themselves warm?
So the dwarf lemurs in Madagascar, they all hibernate in the winter time, and that's different from other lemurs. As I mentioned, the mouse lemurs is their cousins. There is some variation there, where some mouse lemurs might not hibernate, some might. And in the case of mouse lemurs, the ones that stay active, they sort of find ways to survive by eating foods that they don't usually eat or they prefer during the summertime. So mouse lemurs are more flexible. They can, as omnivores, they can rely on things that they are available even in the winter time. Dwarf lemurs, however, are kind of stuck because they really are fruit specialists. So fruits are very hard to come in the winter time. So they sort of have to hibernate in order to really survive that period of food scarcity, which brings the question of how vulnerable dwarf lemurs may be to habitat change or to climate change and things like that. Because if they are not able to store enough fat to survive hibernation, if the fat is not enough and they come out of hibernation in the middle of the winter, they're in trouble because really they don't have anything to eat. So they are more vulnerable to predation and may not survive it.
All right, great question, Genevieve. I'm going to grab a question here from YouTube. This is from Barna, who's joining us in India, and he's curious about how do they select the tree hole for hibernation? Is there any criteria? Is there something that makes a good hibernation spot?
So, I mean, that's an interesting and good question, because there are, I'm guessing, in Dwarf Lemur mine, there are some criteria, the perfect tree hole. I have to make the point that in the east of Madagascar, they hibernate underground. They don't hibernate inside tree holes. It is the western dwarf lemurs hibernating inside tree holes. And the idea is that if you are a hibernator, you would like to find a spot that is fairly stable in temperature. So you would like to go into a tree hole that will maintain sort of the same temperature inside, regardless of how hot or cold it gets outside. So in the west of Madagascar, dwarf lemurs use, if they find tree holes inside baobabs, which are these large trees that can keep the temperature inside quite insulated or buffer from the environment. So they go first into the baobabs. If there are not enough baobabs and dwarf lemurs don't get to choose the big tree, they might have to use other maybe crappy trees. So some dwarf lemurs in the west end up hibernating in the skinny tree holes, and those are not, I guess, the best tree holes, but they still use it. And what happens? Something very, I guess, amazing happen when a dwarf lemur hibernates in a skinny tree. It means that when it is hot during the day, the tree and inside the tree hole will get warm. And so the dwarf lemur actually will passively increase their body temperature. And as it gets cold in the night, during the night, and the tree hole gets cold, then the dwarf lemur will reduce the body temperature. So they go into these sort of fluctuations, going up and down, because of the poor insulation of those tree holes. So to answer the question, they would prefer, I would say, tree holes inside thick trees so they can stay there at a stable temperature, but they would take basically any tree hole available if those are not available for them.
Okay. So Connie's got a question. Connie's wondering, can the dwarf lemurs, can they decide if they don't want to hibernate? Maybe it's a year the temperature doesn't go down as much or food's still available. Is it something that they're going to do every year, or in a good year, can they just pass over it if they want to?
I guess I wish they could, but I don't think they can. And so they imagine the situation, they need to prepare for hibernation before times go really bad, right? So when there is so much food there, they need to sort of think ahead and eat as much as they can to put in a lot of fat, which means that these animals sort of have sort of internal clocks or even an internal calendar that is telling them to start to get fat before even winter and bad times, are coming. And the way that they seem to do it, let's see if I can say this sort of clearly, they can tell if it is summer or if it is winter, and they do that by be sensitive to photoperiod. They can sort of measure the length of the days. So summer times, days are long. Winter times, days are short. And the way that you can tell is that they have some chemicals, some hormones, and you can learn more about things like melatonin. And this hormone is secreted, is released during the nighttime. So the more melatonin there is, the longer the night. And so by measuring, among other things, the amount of melatonin, they can really tell if it is winter today, if it is summer, if it is fall or spring. And so there is something that they turns on that is, we call it a switch, that when days are getting, short actually during the summertime when things are available, they will switch on and start getting fat. So the fattening happens every year for these dwarf lemurs and try to take advantage of the food. And then by the time winter comes, they are prepared. So really, I don't think it's in their power to decide not to hibernate, because by the time that food is there, they're going to try to get as fat as possible. And if they fail, to put a lot of fat. And that happens a lot with the juveniles that are sort of like, new to this. And they may hibernate for short periods. They still do, but once the fat is gone, they sort of have to come out of it.
Okay. Got another question here. This one's from Tartan Jug, and she is wondering if the lemurs hibernate for 7 months, then that gives them just a short period to breed. So how long is a dwarf lemur's gestation period?
Yeah, that's one of the things that really fascinated me the most at the beginning. It is totally true. They have a very short active period, if you will. So that means that things do very quickly and compress during that period. When they're active, right after they come out of hibernation, they mate, and they have this short gestation period. It's only 2 months. And after 2 months, so imagine the situation, they come out in October in Madagascar, they give birth in December, and then they need to wean their offspring also pretty quickly, because these juveniles, these infants, need to grow really quickly in order to be able to hibernate. So gestation is 2 months. The weaning takes about 2 months. And so by the time that these infants are weaned, the females, they start to put, after lactation is gone, they start to put fat as fast as possible. Something that is very interesting about infant dwarf lemurs is that they are born and they have the ability to grow very fast, much faster than other animals their size. So they need to really be able to become independent quickly. And so during the first couple of months, they grow their teeth very quickly, they grow very fast. And then about 2 months, where they are still quite small in size, they are still obviously juveniles. What they do is also they turn a switch and they stop growing in size, and they start putting fat in their tails. So they're going to try to store fat so they can survive their first hibernation period. And juveniles tend to hibernate for shorter times just because they cannot put as much fat as their adults. And then after 2 or 3 years, they will sort of go into the more regular pattern.
Okay, another question here. This is from James. He's in Connecticut. And James is wondering about the dwarf lemur's predators. So what are some of them? And then is it a little bit risky for them to hibernate? Are predators actively looking for them in their spots?
Yeah, that's also interesting. And I think I would say that it depends on the dwarf lemur. So if you are in the rainforest and you hibernate underground, what it seems to happen is that you are at more risk of getting eaten by a predator during the active season, actually, not during the hibernation season. So when you're active, you're looking for food, you're moving around. There are many kinds of things that can eat you. Most prominently types of birds, predator birds. We have the fusa and other carnivores, but the experience of studying these animals in the rainforest, usually birds get you first. When they are hibernating underground, there is some anecdotal evidence that maybe a carnivore can get you from your underground hibernaculum, but for the most part, they survive. They can hide and they survive well during hibernation. In the west of Madagascar, when they hibernate inside tree holes, unfortunately, some things can get into the tree holes. So you have things like big snakes that can go in and predate on lemurs, and then everything else too, right? In the active season in the west of Madagascar, also birds, carnivores. I think hibernating inside a tree hole, I would dare to say maybe it's a little bit more riskier than hibernating underground.
Okay, and Marina, I'm going to hit you with one more question here. This one is about the tree hole or the spot underground. Have you ever seen them return to the same spot, during subsequent years, or is it a new hibernation spot each time? Like the same tree hole, or do they have a little den that they prefer?
Well, my experience is more on the rainforest side of things. Had more years there, and dwarf lemurs have territories like other lemurs, of course. And sometimes the interesting thing is the hibernation sort of area is maybe different from the territories that they use when they are active, eating and things like that. I have seen dwarf lemurs picking the same areas for hibernation, not exactly the same spot, but sort of the same areas that they recognize as territories. Within, a hibernation season, I have seen that some dwarf lemurs stay in the same spot for 7 months and they don't move. In some cases, I have seen that some animals move. And what triggers that move, I don't know, maybe they did some disturbance and they sort of come out of hibernation and they move to a different place. So there is a little bit of variation in terms of how many times they change within a year. And as far as across years, they tend to use the same areas, but not necessarily the same spot. I would guess that in the West, if what I know from communicating with other colleagues is that during the active season, dwarf lemurs occupy certain kinds of tree holes, and those tree holes are different from the tree holes that they use as hibernation sites. And I would expect that some of those hibernation sites, especially in these big baobabs, are good enough that they would go back year after year.
Okay, so I was going to wrap it there, but we do have one more question I'm going to sneak in, and it's, out of 100 plus species of lemurs, what got you so interested in hibernating lemurs, in the dwarf lemurs?
I think it was a series of kind of lucky events. Briefly, I come from Argentina. I was an anthropologist studying sort of human populations, and then I became interested in evolution. And so I contacted a professor in the University of Massachusetts, Dr. Lori Godfrey, and she turned out to be an expert on giant lemurs. And so she was sort of like the first influential woman scientist that inspired me to learn about Madagascar. And then years later, met another influential scientist, Dr. Pat Wright, and she started telling me about all these different lemurs that she knew from Grandma Fan, including the mouse lemurs. So I started this sort of trajectory of lemur research with the mouse lemurs. And by studying them, I learned a little bit about dwarf lemurs, and I became fascinated by this sort of extreme life. The fact that there is this primate that is an obligate hibernator and really is sort of committed to this strategy. And as I said in the presentation, there are many other animals that hibernate, but being the only primates, and I just needed to know a little bit more about them, and now it's sort of like a life passion.
All right, very cool. Well, first of all, a huge thank you to everybody who joined us live via social media, whether it was on Facebook today or via YouTube. Shout out to Genevieve and her sister hanging out in Oshawa. Thanks so much for joining us. Let's pop them back in for a second. There they are. I think, Genevieve, how many of the lemur sessions have you joined us for? I think you guys love the lemurs.
We've done all of them except for one.
All of them except for one. Pretty cool.
That's a record.
All right. Well, obviously, Marina, a huge thank you to you and a huge thank you to Lydia. Thank you so much for putting together this 4-part series for us. Obviously, we look forward to some more, diving deeper into lemur research and action. And next week, we'll have our next event with Duke Lemur, again, Thursday at 10 o'clock Eastern. We'll meet up with Matt Roths, and we will go into the fossil action at the Duke Lemur Center. So we're looking forward to that. Again, Marina, a huge thank you for joining us today, and we are going to sign off.